My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic, multiverses, Mega Christmas, Stranger's franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
And we stew on it for several thousand years until something that we actually care about shows up.
So, Beeper, as you alluded to, we are talking about Eternals today, the latest and now third MCU movie for this year, 2021, having been released in theaters. Let's just dive on into our secret origin segments. I feel like this will be relatively brief.
Yep.
So, how were you first introduced to Eternals?
There was a trailer for this Marvel movie called Eternals, and it had, the guy from Game of Thrones in it, but not Kit Harington.
But Kit Harington's in it too.
Is Kit Harington in it?
Yeah.
Wait, am I thinking about that?
He has a smaller role, but he's in it. There is another guy from Game of Thrones who's in the main cast. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The guy who plays Robb Stark is in it. He's one of the leads, but Kit Harington is in it. Oh, okay. Well, cool. And then I saw a second trailer, and it looked dumb, and now we're talking about it on the podcast.
So you had no idea, like, didn't you hear from the owner that the movie was happening at any point before you saw the trailer?
I may have heard, like, vaguely, there is a Marvel movie called Eternals that's happening. And I feel like it's somehow, I think it's one of the more, like, modern Marvel properties, relatively, because it's not the same as not the Immortals, but the...
Inhumans?
Well, no, I knew it wasn't Inhumans, but it sounded at first a little bit like the Celestials, but it's not.
Oh, the Celestials. Well, the Celestials are involved, as we'll discuss.
Oh, okay.
My secret origin isn't really more robust than that. I've spoken, I think, many times now about that fabled San Diego Comic-Con 2019, the last in-person Comic-Con, where Marvel Studios had a big panel where they basically announced everything that was going to be happening in Phase 4. And I remember being excited about a lot of the other announcements and whatnot. And then when it came to what was then called The Eternals, I said, huh? What the heck is this? Because I had never, in all my years, heard of the Eternals before. But I knew the movie was happening. I knew it was going to be happening. It was supposed to come out November 2020, I think was the original release for it.
I guess I heard the name a lot in our Dooms delay too. Then, which may have happened before I saw the first trailer.
So I really, and I think this is the case for a lot of people, knew nothing of it, the Eternals, before this movie was announced. And hearing more about what the movie was going to be about, and the trailers really didn't do anything to get me excited about it. And I think we've talked about that on the show before, that there was nothing about it that really jumped out at us.
Trailers, I feel like it was this weird thing where the trailers seemed to be like preemptively addressing the nitpicks from the fans before it even happened. Like, because I feel like every trailer has had some kind of a, why didn't you help when Thanos came? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you help the Avengers? And it's just like, okay, we get it. You don't have to over-explain it every time. Plus, it's Marvel. They're less territorial than DC, but it still has like, people have other things to deal with. They have different types of threat they're looking for. It's the same reason Captain Marvel wasn't there. It's the same reason Doctor Strange doesn't solve every problem, is because they have different, level of expertise and different information that makes them deal with different threats.
All right, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the comic book origins of this franchise.
Yes.
The Eternals appeared in Eternals #1 in July of 1976. So if you're thinking about this, they're actually they're a relatively newer comic book character group.
Still older than I thought they were.
Well, I find this so fascinating because I looked it up over the entire, 45 years that the Eternals have existed. There's only about 5 years worth of comics about the Eternals that were published. Like every time they've had a run of comics, it's only gone for like a year or a year and a half. And they've been used a little bit in like Thor stories and other Marvel things. But in terms of just actual comic books about these characters, there's only about 5 years worth of content. That is where we're at in terms of where the MCU is pulling characters from. Like, I don't know how you can go, I guess, even less than 5 years of content, but this is truly bottom of the barrel.
Yeah, I mean, that makes Guardians of the Galaxy seem like a successful franchise.
And wouldn't you know it, that's including a series that started in like January 2021, because naturally they had to have a series out, in preparation for this movie.
Has it been canceled yet?
As far as I can tell, it's still running, but it's, if it lasts,
let's hope the movie does well.
If it lasts into 2022, it will, because I think the longest run the Eternals had was about a year and a half. So they're getting up to almost a year now, with it being November 2021. But this also gives us a chance to talk about Jack Kirby, because he is a comic book creator who we haven't really talked a lot about on the podcast, which is surprising considering how long this show has been going on for.
Oh, I guess we didn't do an episode on. I thought we we need to put Invincible in the bad jar then.
Invincible, Jack Kirby's not involved.
Which one am I thinking about then?
I have no idea.
Yeah, never mind. Yeah, okay.
But that's
I know
okay.
what I'm talking about. I can't remember his name.
Yeah. You might be thinking of Robert Kirkman, perhaps?
Yeah, that's who I was thinking about.
Okay. So do you know who Jack Kirby is?
He isn't he the one who the guy who worked with Stan Lee but kind of doesn't get a lot of credit for everything that happened while they were working together?
Yeah. So in the comic book world, Jack Kirby is considered the king of comics, because he started working as an illustrator in comic books in the 1940s. And he's sort of one of the ones that sort of stuck it out through the 50s. And then with Stan Lee's stories, he is listed as a co-creator on most of the famous Marvel characters. The main exceptions would be Spider-Man and the Doctor Strange. In fact, he actually did drawings of Spider-Man, but Stan Lee said they looked too handsome. Like, he's like, your Peter Parker doesn't look, he looks too handsome to be Peter Parker. So they had to have another artist do it.
That makes sense.
And it's a topic of debate in the comic book world about how much credit do we give Stan Lee for all of these creations versus Jack Kirby, because Stan Lee came up with the ideas and then he handed it to Jack Kirby and said, here's the story, draw it. So how the characters look and how they move and how the stories played out visually, all the credit really goes to Jack Kirby, but people think of Stan Lee as the guy because he came up with the ideas. And, to bring it in the manga perspective, usually this is the same person doing the writing and the drawing. So there's no issue of just debating who's more responsible for the creation.
Yeah, but I think it's more akin to something like, all comics kind of have, non-Japanese comics have this, but I think it's more like something like a story like Roald Dahl and Quentin Blake, that did a lot of things together. And like what people think of when they think of Roald Dahl stories, like visually, is always Quentin Blake's illustrations, right? because he did the illustrations for all his novels, a few of his poetry compilations, as well as other random works together. And I'm not saying he does. It's not exactly the same thing because character design is far less important in stories, written stories, than in comic books. But it is still something there that he usually doesn't get a lot of credit for, kind of what has entered our consciousness for the Roald Dahl stories, right? Like the BFG looks the way he looks like because we have those illustrations.
Yeah, and back then, artists weren't paid, like they weren't paid employees of the comic book companies. They were paid, basically they were called work for hire, so they were paid by the page. So they would get a certain amount of money per page of art that they produced. And that meant that, and Jack Kirby more or less knew this as he was working for these companies, but all these characters he was creating, he was relinquishing all ownership of those characters to the company. So, I mean, and there's been legal battles in the decades since about from his estate, because he passed away in the 1990s, about what's fair for him and whatnot. But the Eternals comes at an interesting point in his career because he got frustrated with Marvel and left in the late 60s. He stopped working with them and actually started working for DC. And it was at DC he was given more creative control, where he became the writer and the artist of stories he was creating. So everything that we know about Darkseid and the New Gods, that whole part of the DC universe that is referenced a lot now in the movies and other media, that was all created and developed by Jack Kirby.
Which is interesting because I feel like people still talk about him more in relation to like everything that happened with Marvel rather than with DC.
Yeah.
Which I guess is kind of, I don't know. It is kind of indicative. People prefer to talk about drama than talk about people's accomplishment, but still is a little sad.
Yeah, and he, after about 5 years of working for DC, I guess he had some kind of falling out there too, and went back to Marvel, and that's when he did Eternals, and he was the writer and the artist on that. So I'm guessing either he was soured by DC or Marvel offered him something to give him more creative control, so he got to write and draw Eternals. And if you compare the stories of the New Gods in DC to his Eternals in Marvel, like there are definitely some similarities. Godly beings with inspirations from old legends and myth, but in a sci-fi setting, kind of coming to Earth. I know I'm being very vague, but there are some.
But it is kind of a vague concept there too. Like,
yeah. But nonetheless, Eternals did not do well, and all the kind of ideas that Jack Kirby had, I guess you could say that maybe they were ahead of their time because they just didn't last very long. And here we are. we're at the point where the MCU is adapting movies based on very obscure characters that have never been like household names for Marvel, which I suppose for the fans of those obscure comics, this is exciting. But I think of our conversation about Shang-Chi, that movie is very loosely based on the comics it's based on. So anybody out there who is a fan of those comics would have been disappointed by the movie, I think. And as we get into talking about Eternals, it might have a bit of that same problem.
But at the same time, I don't know, because obviously you're the one who watched this one, not I. But like, when we were talking about Shang-Chi, it also sounded like what they did do was, rather than directly pay homage to like the character and how he was in the comics, was trying to rewrite him to be a more, culturally appropriate and less kind of
Stereotypy.
Yeah, less of a stereotype, which is something that Marvel has been trying to move away from. I guess they wouldn't hit the same problem with Immortals, but you still, but there are still like stereotypes that have to do with like legends and lore that they tried to move Thor away from because just the idea of him speaking in Shakespearean English all the time. They were like, yeah, that's a little silly. Maybe we could do something different.
I think the development of this movie kind of goes back to even before it was announced in 2019, because at some point, I want to say it was like 2014, Marvel had announced they were going to be doing an Inhumans movie. I don't know if you remember this, but it was on their release slate for a while. They were going to be building towards an Inhumans movie.
Yeah, I remember that being a thing.
But around the same, this is an example of how Marvel Television and Marvel Studios were not on the same page, because around the same time that they announced that they were going to make an Inhumans movie, Marvel Television started including Inhuman characters in Agents of Shield. And then somehow they beat Marvel Studios to the punch and got that Inhumans television show made instead, which I have yet to watch, but I've been told it was awful and it was canceled after like 8 episodes. So
Yeah, well, didn't they? I mean, yeah, they Agents of Shields is a strange show because like people loved it, but it clearly just had such a big disconnect with what Marvel Studios was doing for movies that it kind of just like almost became its own worst enemy.
yeah. And so I don't know how it all worked behind the scenes. So basically, Marvel Studios abandoned their Inhumans movie because the television people got to using those characters first. So I wonder, I don't have any proof, but my suspicion is that all the interest they had in making the Inhumans movie was then pivoted towards Eternals, because there are certain parallels between the Inhumans, especially like the main roster of Inhumans, and the Eternals we see in this movie. And they had laid some groundwork for this concept because they talk about Celestials in Guardians of the Galaxy, with Ego being a Celestial, and like there was some build up to the concepts they have here.
I mean, yeah, but you could have also gotten to the more or less the same place just with like the way Thor movies have been going, where you've got like Thor and Guardians of the Galaxy, where you got kind of the more space and cosmic forces going toe to toe. Like I feel like there was enough of a build up before that like with between Thor, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Doctor Strange, that you don't necessarily need to kind of throw the Celestials in as well. But I guess they are mostly in those stories. But like I don't know, I feel like Ego is better as a Guardians villain than as a introduction into the MCU, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the conversation around this movie in the last couple of weeks has been its Rotten Tomatoes score. I am so fickle with Rotten Tomatoes. When the number is a number for a movie I like, I'm like, yeah, this is great. Look at this. Look what the tomato meter is saying. See, but then when it isn't showing my way, I'm quick to dismiss it as a valid source of information. So I realize how biased I've been, and I can honestly say, like, I think as I looked this morning, the tomato meter for critics was like 49% for Eternals.
Oh, that's lower than last time we spoke.
Yeah. And that means it's the lowest. People are pointing this out. It's the lowest Rotten Tomatoes critic score for any MCU movie ever.
Oof. Yeah, that does not bode well.
But the audience score is in the neighborhood of like 83, 84%.
Yeah,
it's a lot better. But then
it's a lot. Yeah, it's less of a difference than not Carnage, the first one, the first Venom movie. But although actually no, it might be more than a difference now, because it did really poorly, but then really well with the audience. But I think it did better than this one is doing with the audience, but also better with the critics. So I don't know if that's the basis on which we're to judge this movie. That is definitely concerning.
Well, and this is why you need to have nuance when you're talking about a movie like this, because the way Rotten Tomatoes works is they look at a review from a critic, and if it's positive, then they give it a 100% fresh, or they give it a 0% rotten. Basically, it's like, is the review good or bad? And so the percentage, all that tells you is if there's more positive reviews than negative reviews. And it's up to the person working at Rotten Tomatoes to decide, is this a positive review or is this a negative review? It's very biased one way. Like, it's up to their interpretation. So if you say this movie was okay, are you tempted to give that a positive or or negative rating?
Right. I guess it depends on who's working. I mean, I feel like there should be some kind of like more or less objective point of view to be, I don't know, looking at. That makes sense. Like a kind of, this is the standard you're supposed to be holding to.
Right. Well, if a movie's good or a movie's bad, then that works really well because then you can clearly see, okay, yeah, this is rated very high or
Yeah.
very low. But for movies like this, my girlfriend pointed this out. She said it's like a s'more of a movie. it's very messy to try and pick up and eat.
I see. Yeah.
So,
but yeah.
Okay, let me put it this way.
But I feel like that was kind of a similar thing that Venom had, was that it was like it had some things that were really fun, but then also some things that were easy to nitpick. And maybe that's all it is. Hopefully it's all it is that like there are a lot of like there might be a lot of things that are fundamentally pretty bad about it, but like I don't know. That's what you hope for. There's a few things that don't make much sense, but then the good things are really good.
That's a good way of putting it. I would just, after having seen the movie, it is not a 49% movie in my opinion. It is better than that, but it's definitely not a great movie. Like, I didn't love it. I had an enjoyable experience, but if I were to give the movie like a newspaper review, it would probably be somewhere middle of the road, and I could see how Rotten Tomatoes might end up listing that as a negative review because I'm not really saying anything. It's kind of like one of those, you're handing out a participation medal being like, well, you did your best, seemingly.
You were a movie.
You were a movie. And then on top of that, Cinema Score, which is another metric of measuring movie quality. For people who don't remember, Cinema Score is that they're a company that they interview people as they're exiting the theater, and they ask to give their first impression as like a school grade of like, F to A+. And most MCU movies do about a B+ or higher. This one got a B, like a solid B. And that's, again, like the lowest Cinema Score an MCU film has ever gotten. It's certainly, it's, if you compare it to all Marvel movies that have ever been made from like all different studios, that it's probably middle of the road. But because the Marvel Cinematic Universe has this like esteem of, oh, everyone loves these movies, it's kind of standing out in a way I guess it wouldn't want to be standing out.
Yeah, but I mean, that's also buying into the everybody loves MCU movie. I don't know, but maybe like there are a number of circumstantial things that are not to its advantage. I think like it's a pretty, like, it's kind of newly back into theaters. People kind of want something really good. It's also kind of, I feel like more and more movies that are coming out in theaters, they're doing it more if it was something that they put a lot of effort in. Like, and even like some of the movies that are coming out right now, like Dune, I've heard only good things about both Dune and the James Bond movie, whereas Eternals might just not be living up to it. And I think you and I privately talked about, this is the follow-up movie for an Academy Award winning director, which I think definitely for the critics probably skews their opinion. And I feel like, especially if you're somebody reading and trying to determine if it's a positive or negative review, if you hear something like it's a disappointment after this or they can do better, it's a lot easier to give it a negative score.
Right. Box office wise, we're recording a little earlier than we would normally, but it is projecting to make about 70 million its opening weekend, which is around the same neighborhood as Shang-Chi, but less than Venom 2.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't think that Venom was going to be beaten. Like, look, Venom wasn't an amazing movie, and I doubt Let There Be Carnage was anything tremendous, but at the same time, it already had a lot of fans. Whereas, like, it had a lot of hype, it had a lot of fans going into it. Whereas I feel like this one, like we said, it was kind of a much more unknown variable in the Marvel kind of universe, and so you probably don't have as many diehard fans, and it wasn't a sequel, which makes it harder to sell.
Yeah, and most people I've talked to who are like even MCU fans they're like, yeah, I'm not too sure about that one. I think because that's the other thing too. There's so much MCU content now that I guess we're starting to lose that I must see everything mentality. It's like, well, I'll just wait for the Hawkeye series, or I'll just wait for Spider-Man.
Yeah. I mean, other than my wife, I think generally most people, yeah, have kind of hit that point, but that's not necessarily a bad thing either because it's a motivation to kind of do better generally, which I think Marvel might need right now because it, it's going a lot more hit and miss than it used to. And I feel like even just the planning for Phase 4 really wasn't on the same level. And probably partially because, yes, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel and they're not doing their big names anymore. But also, I feel like narratively, the only big thing they've kind of dropped recently is Kang the Conqueror. And even there, he's not that big of a, like, I don't know. They've played their hand early with a lot of things like Thanos, like the Infinity Wars, like Age of Ultron, and now it's great that Age of Ultron was done properly in a TV show, kind of, but you still the way that Ultron ended in the MCU kind of shut him down, whereas he's supposed to be more of a recurring villain. And I feel like the way to fix that would be to bring kind of a bigger name than Kang the Conqueror. I'm thinking somebody like Doctor Doom. I know they couldn't do it immediately, but now they can. So why not be a little more patient and bring him in? Or, you know, uh, Galactus, or I know those are both Fantastic Four villains primarily, but they are also villains that have given the Avengers, in whatever form of team they are, a good run for their money.
All right, let's get into this movie itself. I'll kindly ask you to ask me for the Blu-ray case.
Yes, of
description.
course. Average Joseph. Average Joe. Will you give me the Blu-ray description, Blu-ray case description of Immortals? I said it wrong, didn't I?
Eternals.
Eternals, yeah.
This Friday, Marvel Studios' Eternals arrives in theaters. It's epic,
We've loved humanity for 7,000 years, but we can't stand by any longer.
emotional,
When you love something, you protect it.
visually stunning, pure magic. Unlike anything you've seen before.
It is time.
Marvel Studios' Eternals, rated PG-13. Get tickets now.
You thought you knew the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You thought you knew how the universe worked, but there's a whole nother aspect of the cosmology of the MCU you've yet to realize until now. Meet the Eternals, a group of aliens that were sent to Earth to protect the planet 7,000 years ago, and they are seemingly immortal, and they've lived all throughout human history up until present day. But suddenly a threat emerges from their past that forces them to come back together as a family and save the world.
Yeah. Not to this is not a comment about your Blu-ray case description. It's more about the MCU, but I feel like at this point, you thought you knew the MCU cosmology or the MCU universe is no longer a surprise, a thing people do believe. I mean, it changes its mind on time travel every time it introduces it. It changes its mind on what's more important in the universe. I don't know. I feel like at this point, they are throwing a lot of things at the wall, and it is becoming less and less coherent. Which, again, I'm not necessarily against, especially with, multiverses being in there. You might as well just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, in a certain sense. Well, when I say throw everything of quality to the kitchen to the wall and see what sticks. But because you could just say, use the excuse that it's in an alternate reality, but they seem to be intent on still trying to make it one cohesive universe, and it's getting less and less cohesive. And not just because it's more complicated, but because it kind of breaks its own internal rules.
I mean, granted, this is the problem that shared comic book universes run into, is that you have all these layers of all these different things that are supposed to be existing within the same space. And so in a sense, it's being faithful to the comic book world by being very
absolutely. But that's the thing. It's trying to have its cake and eat it too. It's trying to be both accurate to that, but also try to like, but it is still also trying to be like a more coherent thing, and I think that's playing to its disadvantage in more recent things.
So not being familiar with the comic books for Eternals, and I intentionally avoided reading about the Eternal comic book characters before seeing the movie because I wanted to like receive the movie as it was and then look into the research after the fact. But seeing the movie, I was familiar with, you mentioned Galactus. I was familiar with the dynamic that Galactus had with the Silver Surfer, where Galactus is this giant entity who's almost like a god, and he sort of sends the Silver Surfer as a herald to see if the world is worth eating or not.
One of the many heralds of Galactus, one might add.
This kind of works in reverse. The Celestials are sent by, or sorry, the Eternals are sent by the Celestials, who are these seemingly divine individuals who have these immense power and seem to be responsible for the creation of things in the universe. They're sent as scouts essentially to different planets to see if they're worth protecting or not. At least that's what we're told at the start. That's the
premise on which we begin on the movie.
Yeah.
Are we going into spoilerverse?
Not quite. But that's what I say. This movie, some people have said it's really slow, and that the pace is slow, and that the characters seem disinterested in what's happening because they're playing people who've lived for thousands of years. So it's kind of, their emotional reactions to things are a little more nuanced because they've seen so many things.
Which honestly is, I don't know, it's a tough one to do. I know very few like franchises that have done that very well, and honestly I think the one that has done it the best is a webcomic called Rice Boy. Like Highlander kind of does it a little bit, but even there you got to take it with a very big grain of salt, considering what ends up happening in that movie. But I don't know, I always found that kind of a fascinating thing, because you don't often get characters that are like almost that are actually immortal or almost completely immortal. You often get like old people who have been doing one specific thing, and it's a really tough one to land. And I don't know, I also feel like if you do it properly, you can have very interesting dynamics, because not all of them will have taken the same approach to it either.
Yeah, this I mean, again, I had an enjoyable experience watching this, but I can acknowledge that narratively it is very complicated. It is convoluted. It introduces ideas that then there's twists within the movie that kind of play on what has already been established. So you're like, okay, an hour ago I was supposed to believe that this thing was the reality, but now I'm telling that this is actually...
Okay, yeah.
So in some ways, I wrote down, it feels like there's two movies of material here. Like I feel like there could have been one Eternals movie that was about them landing on Earth in ancient times and then like showing them living out their lives throughout history. And then there could have been a second movie set in modern day, kind of showing them dealing with the present day plot, because all throughout this movie, since we're meeting these characters for the first time, we are getting flashbacks showing them at different points in human history, living in different places like Babylon or Mesopotamia.
Right.
And
Oh, okay. Kind of like how the introduction, maybe not to this degree, but how like the introduction to X-Men Origin Wolverine would have been a better movie than X-Men Origin Wolverine was.
Exactly. Precisely. And
yeah.
In the defense of the movie, I actually enjoyed the flashbacks. I thought the way they brought them up were very narratively interesting, because the different flashbacks would be themed on certain characters, so it would like show you a shot of them in present day and then it would cut to them in the past, kind of like how the Watchmen comic book and essentially the Watchmen movie played with flashbacks very thematically.
Yeah, okay, that's a I don't know, I feel like comparing it to the Watchmen movie is a pretty positive comparison, but maybe that's just me because I really like that movie.
Yeah. But it is a very large cast. Like there are 9 Eternals, right? And this is our first time meeting them. So we're trying to get a sense of who all these people are, and they're presented as like a family to one another. So it's like you need to like keep it like a sheet going of like who is who. And I think I compare this to Guardians of the Galaxy, because that was a franchise no one had ever heard of before. But there were only like 4 or 5 characters you had to keep track of and learn the stories of. Here, you've got a group of 9, and there's parts of the movie where different characters are gone, and you're like, where'd that person go? I'm like, oh yeah, they're not involved in this.
Because of the time jumping.
Well, not even the time jumping.
Or
like, there's just scenes in present day where, oh yeah, like where's this person? Oh, because they're off. They're not in this part of the movie.
okay, because I was thinking more like I don't know if you've seen the Good Omens series.
I've heard about it.
Well, because there's a couple of episodes where you just see Aziraphale and Crowley meeting each other at different points in history, but in that case, it's only 2 people, so it's very, it works a lot better and it's not as abrasive. So I was thinking maybe that's what it was. It's just like, well, who's in this storyline? It also kind of sounds like almost like it could have been, this movie would have been better suited to be a Marvel TV show.
Yeah. Honestly, it would have. Now that you're saying that, it would have definitely been better as one of the Disney Plus shows. Because it has that let's get the band back together story, right? Like they briefly establish who they are and they land on Earth, and then it's mostly in present day. And it's like something's happened. We got to get the Eternals back together. And so it's the cliche. Let's go find this person. Where are they? What are they doing now? And
right, what's their deal? And
it's just a pet peeve of mine when movies do that with a group of characters that you're meeting for the first time in this way. It's like, how am I supposed to care about the fact that the group's not together anymore when I've just been introduced to the group in the last hour?
Yeah, it's the get the band together is a fun narrative thing to do, but it doesn't always work very well.
I mean, I love the Country Bears movie. Don't get me wrong.
But I think it's also, I don't know. You can do it I feel like you can do it in such a way where, like, I don't know. Do they usually have a flashback of the person before they go find them?
It's not necessarily,
because I feel like that would be a good way to do it. Is you introduce who they were in the past to kind of just get an idea, and then you see them in the future, and then that gives you, a point of reference and also an interesting way to see, maybe they are the same person, maybe they're somebody completely different.
I will say Kumal Nanjiani, he's so funny in this. There are like attempts to be funny, but his lines, he has like this valet who accompanies him through most of the movie, and their rapport, their comedy is hysterical. There were a couple characters who kind of stood out to me personally. Specifically, I mentioned Kingo, Sprite, and Gilgamesh. I thought they were very interesting characters. I can't really get into why without going into spoilers.
I mean, Gilgamesh, because he can beat everybody with a single move, right?
No, not this.
Because he has an eternal treasury of weapons.
No, not this one.
Including one that can take out an entire reality marble. Sorry, I'm going a little too far into the Fate Stay Night. You've seen it, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So at least, if the audience doesn't understand what I'm saying, at least you do.
This almost goes into M. Night Shyamalan territory when it comes to twists. Like there's one twist about halfway through the movie where you're like, oh, that's a significant change from how we understand the world here. And then there's another one that comes towards the end where you're like, oh, like I didn't see that coming, and that is shocking. But again, it's forcing me to like change my opinion of something that's been established in the last 2 hours. So it's just, I can see why critics are being hard on it. It's like it's a s'more. It's a sloppy Joe.
Yeah.
You pick it up and stuff's gonna fall out, and you're gonna get your hands messy eating this.
A sloppy Joe. Because anyway. No, I that's unfortunate because it sounds like the kind of concept and the kind of story that would work better in a different kind of format, but also just that, like, I don't know, introducing a lot of new characters and a lot of new concepts can work, but I'm drawing experiences from things that I've been reading and watching recently, and like I'm in the 11th season of Supernatural, and that show just keeps changing the rules of the entire universe every season to keep things exciting. And it's something I feel like that was a critique I know somebody made of like Smallville, was that they kept trying to up itself. And I feel like if you're trying so hard to up yourself just for the sake of upping yourself, then you're in trouble. Whereas if you are trying to create, if you're doing a twist, it should be for a purpose, not just to surprise people.
I will say another thing I liked, again, just to try and be positive, they present the Eternals as a family. And even though they are 9 people who are played by actors from different ethnic groups from Earth, who obviously they don't look like they'd be from the same family, if you know what I mean. But they're presented as like brothers and sisters, and they care for each other as family. And something I thought was very, I don't know if this was intentional, probably wasn't, but the way that they addressed family conflict was very great to see. Because there are points in the movie where members of the family disagree with each other heavily on how to take action or how to approach situations that have huge consequences. And yet they respect each other and they'll still love each other despite having those differences. And why I say I appreciate that and I find that refreshing is that unfortunately one of the long-standing effects of this pandemic is that it seems to be driving people and especially families apart. The divisions of opinions on how to deal with certain aspects of COVID-19 have just led to some terrible, terrible things happening within families where people are not even talking to each other anymore or calling each other cowards or calling them this or that. And I just thought we can all learn something from the Eternals in terms of how to approach conflict in a cordial and familial way. Again, I think this was written before the pandemic started, so I don't know if they were intending to kind of communicate that message, but it's certainly one that I received.
Well, I feel like even if it was written before, it sounds, if it's such a core part of the movie, and the subject of, found family or family that, goes beyond blood, or even, if they are actual family, like it's still a major theme. And if that's something, I feel like, the trailers kind of pushed towards it. So I think it might have been, something they wanted. They just didn't realize it would be as relevant as it is. But it still sounded like something that was kind of intentional in it.
And before we go into the spoilerverse, I think this movie would have actually worked better if it wasn't in the MCU. Like if they just made this as, I don't know, like on a multiverse setting or whatever. Because you're right, the trailers had to work hard to try and explain why they weren't involved in any of the movies. And ultimately, we'll get into spoilers. It really doesn't matter the reasons that we're given. But
right,
I think because it was labeled as part of the MCU, people were expecting it to be something that it wasn't, because it is different. It is different from what we usually get. But it's still like a s'more, and I've got sticky marshmallow on my fingers now because of this.
I like it.
So we're going to go inside the spoilerverse now. There'll be a time code in the description where you can skip around if you don't want spoilers. I did my best to try to allude to things without actually referencing them.
You did pretty good. I didn't get anything spoiled. But then again, I also was going in pretty blind. Somebody who has some knowledge might have picked up on some of the things.
Okay. So get this. All the Celestial, or no, the Eternals. Okay, the Eternals, they're robots. And that's something that...
Oh, wait. Like Asimov robots?
Like artificial life forms.
Okay.
It's like they're created by the Celestials to be sent to planets. So that's one of the twists is, we're actually not organic beings. We're robots, basically. We're advanced AI.
Okay.
And then the second twist on top is that, at the beginning of the movie with narration and stuff, we're told that the Eternals are sent to planets like Earth to protect them from these deviants, these like creatures that are out to destroy people. And the idea is that you're supposed to observe and let the natural evolution of the planet happen unless the deviants are involved, because the deviants are supposed to be, they're not part of the natural flow of this planet's history. So the Eternals have the mission of eliminating these things. But then there's a twist later on in the movie where you find out that actually the reason why the Eternals are sent to these planets is to ensure that their populations reach a certain amount, because when the population reaches a certain amount, a new celestial can be born from that planet.
Oh my gosh. They're like the opposite of the gunmen.
The gunmen?
Yeah, not gunmen, the beastmen in Gurren Lagann.
Yes. So basically, like the Celestials in all their power decide that they're going to put a seed inside of specific planets, and once a planet's population reaches a certain amount of people, that's like the magic thing that needs to happen for a new celestial to be born, and basically that planet is destroyed in the birthing of a new celestial.
Interesting.
To me, it's as if they try. It's imagine if they introduced Shield as an organization in Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Like if the first time we had heard about Shield was in that second Captain America movie, where it is then found out to have not been Shield all the time, and it's being taken down. And this is why I say it should have been 2 movies, because within, like, we're meant to believe a certain narrative about what the Eternals are and what the Celestials' purpose is, and then it flips on us partway through the movie. And so a huge part of the modern day stuff is all the different Eternals coming to grips with being told, oh, we're actually, this is why we were sent here, and we're not actually biological beings. And as it turns out, that's faithful to the comics. Like, they are meant to be robots. So,
right.
I mean, I guess I would have been spoiled for that if I had looked into the comics history.
Yeah, but I don't know. I feel like that's not necessarily something that is a twist that can work. Because, I mean, although I get it does feel like you said, if it's in the MCU, it's a little bit weaker because the only Celestial we know was a huge jerk. I'm limiting my language, but Ego was a terrible person, right? And that's the only kind of idea we have for what the Celestials are. And he did refer to the little parts of himself that he planted in the planets as seeds as well, which might bring some confusion. I'm not sure. Here's the thing: are the not variants? What are they called?
Deviants.
Are the deviants trying to keep the population of Celestials under control?
And this is one of the changes. Apparently, in the comics, the deviants are like their own thing that are essentially, like trying to kill people on planets so that. Actually, I don't know what this whole idea that Celestials plant seeds in planets so that new Celestials can be born. That is something that made up for the movie. It seems that in the comic books, the Celestials send Eternals to protect the people, to protect the planets they're sent to. So,
okay.
And in the movie, the Celestials also create the deviants, but I can't even remember. They're basically like,
it was like an accident, or it was
or they stopped doing what they were supposed to do, and so they're like, oh darn it, we've got these rabid dogs that are now killing people on the planets, and we want these planets to grow in population size so our new Celestials can be born. So they had to send Eternals to basically get rid of the deviants on the planets so that the populations would keep going up. And so we're told the line, oh, Eternals aren't allowed to get involved unless a deviant's involved. Like, that's the explanation they give in the trailer and in the beginning of the movie as to why they didn't help out with Endgame or Thanos or anything. But in the end, it doesn't matter, because basically the only reason they didn't get involved is because the Celestials just want the planet's population to go up. And
which also doesn't make sense, because especially with Thanos, who literally have the population, it just seems like you shot yourself in the foot by not interfering there, which I get. I don't know.
Did they have to? They didn't really have to get involved because the humans ended up finding a way to fix that.
Okay, but they're not the TVA. They don't know that.
Yeah, and so I don't know. This is this cosmology of, like within the Marvel universe, there are these Celestials that are constantly birthing new Celestials, and Celestials can create life. So they're saying like billions, new planets can be created and new lives can be created because there's more Celestials. And so that becomes like the source of family conflict, is some of the Eternals are like, this is terrible, we can't let them kill all the people on Earth. And others are like, well, yes, like these people will die, but billions and billions of more lives will come into existence because there'll be a new Celestial.
But that's also still, But I guess that's before they realize the Celestials are all kind of jerks, or
No, even after all that truth is revealed, there's still some of the Eternals that believe that the potential billions of lives that will be created as a result of this new Celestial being born is worth the killing of all the people on Earth.
okay.
And this goes into another
not sure.
problem, is that they make it very clear, oh, like the whole Earth is going to explode. But then there's no one ever says, why don't we try calling the Avengers? Because they reference the Avengers, like it's clearly on the Earth of the MCU. And if you're going to do these movies where you don't have the characters interact, I get it. You have to do solo movies. Not every movie can be a big team up, but you got to give at least some plausible explanation as to why no one from Doctor Strange to the other characters,
Even if it's just lip service, like they did in Black Widow, which was a lot of lip service, but not a lot of logic.
Yeah, like they need to be more. And again, this comes down to the narrative failings of the movie, but they got to be more intentional about. This kind of reminds me of Phase 2, right? Like there's no explanation as to why no one helps out Iron Man and Iron Man 3, why no one gets involved with Thor 2, why no one gets involved with the Winter Soldier stuff. And maybe future media, and it's not even clear like when this takes place. Like we know it's post Snap, obviously, because they talk about everyone coming back. But in relation to WandaVision or Falcon and Winter Soldier or Far From Home, which is supposed to be 8 months after, we don't know when this is happening.
Right, which I think might have been intentional because, well, I don't know, because this also isn't when it was supposed to be released either.
Yeah. It seems like it's...
Because a lot of the other MCU movies were released in mostly chronological order.
Yeah.
Except for a few that had flashbacks, and Captain Marvel.
And Black Panther. Because it's set a week after Civil War.
That's true. But most of them, there was still a good idea of where it was, and the characters had been previously established.
Yeah. It's long enough.
And especially with everything that came before, everything they've done since, you could have just thrown something in there.
Yeah. It's been long enough since everyone comes back that the whole world seems to be functioning like normal. So I wouldn't be surprised.
So that would probably be that'd be after Snowy Owl for sure, right? Because that's still a major conflict of that series, is that they're trying to make the world go back to a sense of normalcy.
But you know what? It shouldn't matter. We should be able to enjoy this movie as it is. And the movie ends with some of the Eternals basically, in the finale, they stop this Celestial from being born. Not all of them are on board with that. One of them actually betrays them, and that's the other twist that I mentioned. You don't see that coming, and that actually genuinely surprised me when I saw it. And there's a bit of a power dynamic, because there's the person who is the most physically powerful, and some of them are like, you should be our leader, and it's like, well, no, our previous leader chose this person to be the leader, so they should be the one leading us. And also, this movie got attention because it's oh, this is the first MCU movie with a sex scene in it. And yeah, there's it's PG-13, but you see a sex scene between two characters, but they're two Eternals. And then I'm like, they're robots. Why did we watch a scene of two robots having sex?
For the first time in the MCU, robots having sex.
But that's again, it's did you think this through? You're trying to portray the love between these two characters and whatnot, and then it's you reveal they're not even biological beings. Very odd.
Well, but that's where why I asked if they were Asimov robot, because the series Robot by Isaac Asimov, robots are a lot closer to androids than actual robots. They're basically human, and they're supposed to guide the human race, basically. And so, if it's that kind of a deal where they're so advanced they might as well be human, which I feel is the case here, then is it if an AI is at the level where it can feel affection, is it really still an artificial intelligence? We're getting into Ghost in the Shell levels of question, but those are questions that I think a premise like that could be asking. Evidently it wasn't, but, you know.
It might have, and I just missed it. I just kind of got stuck on that fact.
Maybe.
So the movie ends. Some of the Eternals pass away. Some of them decide that they're going to live their lives out on Earth, and some of them decide they're going to go into space and like figure out what's the deal with these Celestials.
Well, I guess they weren't that eternal if they die. Sorry.
There's one post-credit scene that shows the three in space, and they meet two new characters.
Oh. New to the MCU or new we've never seen before?
New to the MCU. I recognized one of them by the character's name. Have you heard of Star Fox?
Not outside of Nintendo.
Okay. There's a Marvel character called Star Fox who's like Thanos' half-brother, but he looks like a normal person. I think he has the power to like basically make people aroused, make them interested in him romantically.
I like it.
And he's played by Harry Styles of One Direction, so very interesting choice there.
I like it a little less, but actually he's a good choice for that type of a character.
And he's accompanied by a troll who's voiced by Patton Oswalt, who's like a Marvel character as well. A lot of these characters, they're named after characters of myth because they explain in this universe, because they were living on Earth, that the myths were about these people, or they told stories about these people. Like one of the characters who can fly, his name is Icarus. So they create the story of Icarus flying into the sun as like making fun of him, being like, haha, like in this story, you go to the sun. Yeah,
that's a pretty logical way to look at things.
Yeah, it's fun. And that's one of the elements movie that was good. But so that's post-credit scene 1. We are introduced to Star Fox, and that means like that element of the sci-fi Marvel cosmic stuff is going forward. The second post-credit scene comes at the very end of the movie after the credits. You see Kit Harington's character with the specific sword that is cursed.
The Sword of Cass.
No, I can't remember what it's called.
That's a D&D thing. Don't worry about it.
I knew that Kit Harington's character was a known comic book character, but I didn't know much about him. He's this character called Black Knight.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
He's basically like a knight who's in modern times, and he has this sword that can do all kinds of wild things. And you see him about to touch the sword because he gets romantically involved with one of the Eternals, and they all get sucked up by a Celestial, and he's like, I'm going to go save her.
Okay.
And off screen, you hear a voice saying, "Are you ready for this, Mr. whatever his last name is?" And my friend and I thought it was the voice of Jeffrey Wright as the Watcher kind of saying this to him. But it turns out it's actually the voice of Mahershala Ali, who has been cast as Blade.
So he's gonna be fighting vampires with that sword,
or he's going to be part of the Blade movie, I guess.
Oh man, I was already. The only thing that really has me interested in the Blade movie is I kind of really, really want to see Wesley Snipes on screen, and hopefully he will come with exactly the same energy he did in the first couple of movies. But I don't really care about the character.
He's not in it, right?
I thought he was in it as like an old man or something. I thought he was coming back.
I hadn't. If that's true, I haven't heard. I haven't.
Oh. Well, so now that now I care less about this movie. Although Black Knight is a fun-ish character, so maybe it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of fun that they introduced him here, and then he'll be in other movies because he isn't really in this movie very long. He's like in this movie for maybe 10 minutes.
Okay.
But we were really excited. We're like, oh, it's the Watcher. Like they're really tying in What If, and what does that mean? Why is the Watcher observing this? And it's like, no, it was a totally different voice, and we just didn't recognize the difference. So there you go. He's going to show up in Blade.
Fun.
So coming around to final thoughts, Beeper, I guess since you haven't seen the movie, you have heard me talk about the movie, and based on what you've heard me say, are you interested in seeing this, or how are you feeling?
I'm more interested than I was beforehand. I'm not looking forward to seeing something that might be terrible. But at the same time, you know, it's there are interesting concepts in there that I think I would want to explore, and I know that Mjolnir really wants to see this one, so as much as possible, we will see it at some point, even if it's when it comes out on Disney Plus.
This will definitely appeal to the cosplayer in your wife, because there are a lot of interesting costumes and.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Although that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I feel like it is a movie definitely could set itself up to be both more realistic and less realistic as far as costumes go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kevin Feige, the producer of all the Marvel Studios movies, he mentioned that they wanted to represent human history with this movie. And so they were intentional with casting actors from different ethnic races. And one of the main characters is deaf. And, it feels like when you look at this group standing in a line together, it does feel a bit more like they represent the global population in some respect. And I can imagine if I'm Caucasian, so I don't have that lens, but there are different groups of people represented here that will help them see themselves as superheroes, even to the point where I appreciate one of them is overweight. And I'm like, that's kind of neat to see. As an overweight person myself, you don't see that very often I mean, there's obviously canonical reasons why you wouldn't have overweight superheroes, but I'm getting off.
Generally speaking, yeah, but yeah.
I'm getting off track. The movie's long. It is slow in places. It doesn't land the plane on all the ideas it introduces, but I still enjoyed it. I still had a good time. So I don't want to rip on the movie like some people are. I want to be more fair. I'll give this, we'll say 2.7 out of 4 bat cookies.
Okay. I mean, I think Mjolnir has on several occasions expressed this opinion, probably on the podcast too, that she prefers a swing and a miss to not trying at all. So I think for her sake, I'll give it a 2.5, because I am interested in it. I went from being completely uninterested to kind of interested and want to see what they do with it. So you've convinced me to give it a right down the middle rating. Or no, wait, a 2, because we're out of 4.
And they're stealing from my girlfriend because they use the word vibe as the name of one of their TV spots, and vibe is her word. So Marvel Studios, if you're listening, stop using the word vibe in your marketing. That belongs to my girlfriend and not you. But
yes, because one person. All right, we'll get into that later.
So
I'm a high school teacher, average Joe.
So Eternals is now in theaters. It's going to be streaming there. It'll be playing in theaters exclusively for, I think, 45 days before it'll end up on Disney Plus. Like Shang-Chi is going to be on Disney Plus for free as of this Friday for people. So if you have Disney Plus, you can see Shang-Chi if you haven't yet. But if you're interested, go see Eternals. I don't think it's necessary viewing, and I don't think it's necessary viewing for the MCU going forward. I think this is definitely one you can catch later on. But if you want to see it, it's out there.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
Or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
So normally we would go into the Bat Jar and pull out a topic for next week, but it is going to be our 250th episode next week.
Woo! We made it.
So I haven't really thought of what's the best thing for us to do. I thought maybe it'd be fun for us to talk about our own favorite podcasts, be very meta and say, what are podcasts we like to listen to?
Okay.
Or maybe do we want to share like our favorite movies, like our top 10 favorite movies of all time?
Ooh. Yeah. I mean, I'd have to make that list. I don't have it completely ready.
Well, you've got a week.
Yeah, I got a week to figure out the 10 movies I like the most in the world.
There you go. It's not that hard.
All right. If you say so.
So come back to the Bad Chart podcast next week. It'll be our 250th episode. Wow. We'll be talking about
You'll get to know which movies rock and which don't.
Yes. And maybe we'll say our one favorite podcast. Just
All
to
right.
be a tiny bit meta.
I like being meta.
So until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
Catch on the flip side.
And good night.